Joining Carl this week is Rishi Nigam, CEO of Franklin Junction, as they discuss the rise of synthetic data, GoPuff's new funding round, and why every business needs to plan for outages similar to Cloudflare's in the months ahead. That's all ahead on this week's Digital Restaurant.
Happy Monday, we are back. The Digital Restaurant is here, and as ever, a brand new guest and host for the show, Rishi. Lovely to see you, my friend. How are you?
Great, Carl. Thanks for having me on.
You're a very special guest. This is our last episode of the series, last episode of 2025, so we better make it a good one. There was plenty of stuff happening in the world of restaurants, my friend, and I know you spent a lot of time this week looking at a whole bunch of things to cover, but we went to the world of convenience first, and GoPuff, I think, have secured more funding recently. Tell us about this, and is this a good thing for convenience customers and convenience players?
Yeah, I think it's super interesting because GoPuff had a very differentiated product offering than the other marketplaces or groceries. They started out out of New York City, I believe, just selling a very curated list of SKUs, a lot of local items, a lot of influencer partnership items, locals, organic items. So things that were not maybe readily available in the bodegas or the larger markets. And that was kind of their call sign. And then also obviously the on-demand instant delivery in New York, which was a lot of bikers rather than cars in a densely populated metro like that. So they grew. The timing was great with COVID, and they boomed at that time. Raised a lot of capital, grew to a lot of other cities, and then post-COVID, they hit a wall like a lot of scaled businesses did. Post-COVID, people went back to their habits, and maybe spending habits changed, consumer choices changed, and GoPuff really wasn't able to demonstrate that demand in other markets. And I think they faced some other challenges too. I just think that the products became available at other people use GoPuff as a platform for getting their product in the door. And once they had success, they were able to go to larger distributors and the product became more readily available through other channels. And so those things may have hurt demand. And then also I think that with the lineup of products that GoPuff had, that there's maybe as people became cost conscious over the last couple years that they weren't willing to spend premium on maybe were occasional products. The other thing that we saw is that GoPuff also had hybrid locations where it wasn't delivery only, but it was in-store as well. And that in-store experience, I think, faded over time where it looked like a really nice kind of curated shop to walk through and pick up items. And this is empirical, it's coming from my own experience. And then over time, it became that the demand was a lot more for delivery. And so you saw slowly like there was less maintenance of those spaces. And naturally, that just becomes a vicious cycle. So if you don't maintain those spaces and create that experience for customers, they're going to come less. And so it just became another delivery service. So I do believe that GoPuff still has some cool offerings, but I would assume that this was probably a pretty large down round for them as they did not disclose a valuation here.
Yeah, I think I saw on Bloomberg actually. I mean, maybe Bloomberg got it wrong, but I think it was down to something like 8.5 billion, which is definitely a lot lower than the 15 billion that was quoted back in 2021. So I think you're right.
Yeah.
Definitely a down round. Look, on the plus side, I think they're putting fuel behind their model at a time when less hype probably means more discipline. And I think that's a good sign for the long-term investors who really believe in the spirit of vertical integration and fulfillment tech, right? But the cautionary angle on this is that this model still remains very capitally intensive, subject to high fixed cost traps, and we've seen in many other fulfillment businesses in the retail and restaurant space. And the difference between growth and profitable growth is still very real. And so if you're evaluating a startup in this particular domain right now, you'd be looking not just for the raise and the growth headline, but the tight economics, the density of the fulfillment network, the margin improvement, the retention, loyalty growth, and just that overall way in which they're going to leverage tech like AI and optimization to help them get to that next level. So I think all eyes are going to be on them, Rishi, that's for sure.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you that investors are probably notoriously stingy with valuations right now, and the fact that they're still raising at 8.5 billion, that's nothing to sneeze at. I mean, 8.5 billion probably still makes them more valuable than most national grocery chains. So I think that investors are still probably pretty bullish on their potential outcome there of GoPuff. And just from my personal experience, having been inside some GoPuff facilities, I will tell you that they are extremely tech forward with the way they think about ordering, delivery, logistics, routing, everything, and even down to marketing. The app experience is excellent. So I agree with you. I think AI was built into their DNA, and that's something that they definitely have a leg up on over traditional, maybe fast commerce providers. All right, so next we move on to an article that talks about a new set of studies say consumers plan to spend more at restaurants in the year ahead. Carl, is this true? Do you think customers will really be spending more next year? We're having a historically soft fourth quarter in the restaurant industry. Americans have not classically been ones to save money. Do we think they're saving up for a big 2026? Tell us about it.
Yeah. Well, this was a collection of different data points that Restaurant Business pulled together. Toast, OpenTable, Resi, really paint a picture. And I'll get to your question, but there were some really interesting insights across this one. I mean, first of all, Toast looked at reservation timing and social media patterns, for example. And one standout metric was the shift in reservation behavior, in the sense that early evening bookings have grown by about 6% year over year. Now, it was a year or so ago, I think, when I was talking about this very same report, when it talked about a growth in early evening bookings. So, if anything, this is compounding on top of each other right now. We're seeing more and more people eat earlier, while late night reservations have softened. So, you take that, and then you take this alongside the double-digit uptick in what Toast calls bar seat bookings, which ties to a growing desire for more casual and flexible dining without committing to the full table experience. And then you pair that with some of the insights that they were sharing on social media, where you're seeing now engagement with restaurant related content has risen by more than 10%, which is, I think, a signal, quite honestly, that dining remains culturally relevant, and very much top of mind, but really something where a lot of customers, especially the Gen Zers and the millennials, are basically looking at the worthiness of Instagram and TikTok in determining whether to decide to eat at a restaurant. I think it was 77% of Gen Zers and 79% of millennials use that as a core reason as to whether this place is the right place for them to have the right type of experience. Now, OpenTable's State of the Industry dashboard shows that seated diners in the US year over year remain positive. And the figures bounce week to week, but the overall trend shows consumers are still going out. And this is a data set that covers more than 60,000 restaurants worldwide. So worldwide as an angle. And providing, when you think about the consumer behavior around all this, I feel like OpenTable are really saying this is kind of a bullish signal. I mean, they actually were quoted in the article talking about reservations being up 13%, but typically between 4 p.m. and 5 p.m. And it pointed to survey data which said that more than half of the consumers wanted to see more happy hour promotions, like that time of day, if you will, in 2026, especially as value seems top of mind for folks. Resi were also quoted in the article, and the reservation volume has remained stable across most of their major metro markets, with slight declines in the late night slots. So it's interesting that a lot of different sources are pointing towards the same intent here. OpenTable talked about a 26% increase in counter seating, a 23% increase in bar seating. 26% of consumers expect to see more bar seating in their experiences next year. And then you come to this piece in your question around the spending, right? And the Restaurant Business article cites survey data showing that more than half of the consumers plan to spend the same or more when it comes to dining out in the year ahead. And among higher income households, the optimism is even stronger. And so that, I think, is an important caveat, right? Because there's context to your question. And it's the segment of consumers with more disposable income that intend to spend more. They have the confidence and the financial room to keep dining out and even upgrade their occasions. But the lower income consumers are different. They're also planning to dine out, but they plan to do it perhaps a bit more selectively. And they're going to chase value, trade down, and maybe jump between brands based on deals. So I guess my take here on this one, Rishi, is that we often simplify the conversation by asking if consumers are strong or weak and whether that sentiment should be taken at a grandiose macro level. But the real data, the real story here is one of segmentation. You've got one consumer group ready to spend more, another is willing to spend, but only if they feel that they are getting strong value. And I think that really is the message for restaurants here, is that it's all about the experience. The Toast data on the earlier reservations, the bar seating, suggests consumers are becoming more pragmatic. They want a meal that fits their schedule, fits their mood. They want something easy, flexible, reliable. And when frequency becomes intentional, the experience matters more per visit. Errors are costly, friction becomes more noticeable. And so I think restaurants are going to have to be really mindful of making sure every occasion counts. And then the last part of this is, how are those restaurant groups using the decision intelligence that they can build from their data set, so that when this behavior becomes as fluid as it's probably turning, weekly decisions around things like pricing, menu mix, throughput, they become make or break decisions, right? Operators need that kind of capability now to help them understand the shifts in real time. And I'm not talking massive dashboards, but real operational insights that helps a GM or an area coach know what to fix today based on poor experiences that have just happened. So I'm kind of fascinated by these data points, because all these different entities pointing towards a very similar kind of outcome. What was your take?
Yeah, it's super exciting. I think the one that really caught my eye that I didn't hear you mention was the most booking increase was for the 9 a.m. time slot and the breakfast time slot. And I was just kind of stunned by that because I went online right after I read that and I'm looking on OpenTable and Resi and I'm in Metro Atlanta and I can't find more than a handful of places that'll even take a booking at 9 a.m. So I'm wondering where people are booking and what they have so urgently at 9 a.m. And then it struck me one idea might be the fact that this return to office and more in-person meetings, more in-person collaborative work, and people returning to their normal workspaces might be a driver for restaurants and especially daytime dining out.
All right, let's move to question 3. So some interesting news out of Kroger, and that the fact that they're shutting some of their fulfillment centers in favor of having deeper partnerships with marketplaces. So what's this one about, and what does it mean for restaurants?
Yeah, I thought this was super interesting also because Kroger is considered highly innovative in this space. They're a lot of smart people with a lot of scale and a lot of capital, and they know what they're doing. And so when they make a move like this, I think it can signal something larger for the industry. Kroger has been super innovative and leaned into e-commerce. They had operating profits of about $400 million in 2026. That's what they're expecting. However, they believe that the ability to service or fulfill orders themselves directly through central fulfillment centers is probably not the best route for them. And so they're going to be closing some of their underperforming locations, not all of them, but some of the markets and the second tier locations that were not meeting expectations. And it's going to be a write down of about $2.6 billion to them. So not chump change and certainly not a decision probably taken on a whim or very lightly, but something where Kroger probably calculated that selling a finite number of SKUs to a constrained geography is going to be super challenging to achieve sustainable profits. And they're better off partnering with marketplaces like DoorDash, Uber Eats, and Instacart to reach their customers in a lot of these markets. So I think they're going to continue to grow in their key markets where they see the volume of sales meeting their expectations. But it just goes to show that even a company like Kroger in a space that they dominate nationally, coast to coast, e-commerce is not for the faint of heart. It requires a tremendous amount of investment. It has a very high hurdle of success, and logistics companies like Uber and DoorDash, it further just accentuates what they've been always saying is that logistics requires a tremendous amount of scale. You need to be able to move a lot of things to a lot of people very often for it to be successful. And so I think while it's important to be cautious, this kind of throws a little bit also towards Amazon and Whole Foods, where we're hearing about some recalibration potentially going on there with Amazon's investment in Whole Foods and their ability to deliver groceries on demand to people, and whether that's going to be a continued part of their strategy. I think at the same time, it gives a lot of credibility to how Uber and DoorDash and potentially Instacart are going to be the winners here when it comes to being logistics providers.
Yeah, that's fascinating. When I think back to the former answer you gave around GoPuff, right? It's probably an interesting angle around how they're thinking about this. And maybe this comes back to also just the levels of adoption for this ultra delivery commerce type of idea, right? It was obviously something quite new to us through the pandemic, and it was quite essential for many of us through the
Yes.
pandemic. But maybe it's not necessarily as needed across every demographic in every corner of the country as perhaps Kroger thought it was back when they first made the decisions for these performance centers. So Maybe at some point they'll come back, but at that point, maybe the marketplaces and maybe the GoPuffs of this world will have really got their arms around that particular area.
That's absolutely right. Carl, that leads us to an excellent article QSR Magazine had about how AI and synthetic data in QSR marketing is about visibility, not just efficiency. First of all, I have to say I love the term synthetic data. That makes a lot more sense to me than some of the other vernacular I've heard out there. But how will synthetic data drive 80% of decisions by 2028?
Yeah, it was one of the bold predictions in this particular article in QSR magazine. And when you unpack what the synthetic data is and how it's being used in restaurants, the prediction starts to feel less like hype and more like an early signal. But let's start with the basics, right? Let's talk, what is synthetic data? Synthetic data is data that's generated by algorithms rather than it being captured directly from consumers or from transactions directly, right? So it's created by training models on real data sets, then producing artificial versions that keep the same patterns and distributions without exposing any sensitive information, which of course for consumer data, that's pretty critical. In simple terms, it lets organizations run simulations, test ideas, and train their systems, especially their AI systems, at a scale and a speed that real world data can't really support. And so this article that was written by Ray Kong, who's a CMO for an organization that helps in this space, makes the point that the real benefit isn't just about efficiency, it's visibility. And the fact that brands now should start thinking about how they can use synthetic data to see scenarios that they could not necessarily see before. They can perhaps model a new menu, understand what the impact of a price change could be, or perhaps what if we were to do this particular promotion in the calendar in May versus June, like we did last year, or maybe a drive-through flow, or the operational layout of a kitchen. All of these ideas. I mean, we had an episode with Bernadette a few months ago around digital twins. That kind of builds off the same kind of idea as this. And there are still some practical examples across the industry. Marketing teams are generating synthetic customer segments to strengthen their personalization models, where real sample sizes are small, right? Then maybe there just isn't enough data to build and have some level of confidence over it. So the synthetic data is being applied to help with that. And then pricing teams are simulating elasticity curves using synthetic versions of transaction logs to understand the impact of tweaks without waiting months for natural experiments. So operators, I think, are looking at this and they're saying, well, where do we need to be able to lean on this most? And a little bit like we were just talking about with the decision intelligence attributed to Kroger, I think we're going to start to see a lot of this now starting to shape a view on how do we figure out what the new kitchen layout should be. If you could deploy synthetic order flows to predict choke points, that could be fascinating. I would bet this is happening all over manufacturing like crazy right now. So delivery logistics teams, I think, could also find this interesting, right? When you're thinking about the fulfillment strategies, if you have your own fleet as a restaurant group, is that something whereby you could actually test this in a way to be able to understand if you were to deploy a new location in another corner of town, what would that mean for your business? And I think this is really the heart of the 80% prediction, right? Most decisions in restaurants involve forecasting, they involve scenario planning or understanding how one small operational change cascades through the system. And historically, if we're being truly honest, leaders are making those decisions with limited data, delayed insights, and more often than not, a bit of gut feel. And so I think the synthetic data here is removing or at least minimizing some of those constraints. And it allows models to be trained faster and then scenarios to be tested more. And then maybe to allow decisions to be grounded in richer evidence. And it's not necessarily that I would advocate that synthetic data is going to replace the need to test and to pilot, but maybe it reduces the set of 20 options down to three to four. And that therefore gives you some greater level of confidence about the right direction to take things. So yeah, I think it's pretty interesting, whether it's 2028 or earlier or later, I don't know. But I think ultimately a lot of this is around how can we develop the mentality of having a habit of using synthetic data around validation, using synthetic data in powerful ways so that we don't assume that it's automatically correct, but that we use it, check it against real results, and then refine models accordingly. And I think if we do that, much like we should do today with our uses of things like ChatGPT, then we'll be in a good place to take advantage of it. Have you seen uses of it? Are you guys using it at Franklin?
Yeah, I think actually where I was going to go with this, Carl, is you're one of the leading providers of AI solutions for the restaurant industry. When we think about our friends in the industry, the 10, 15 largest chains in the country represent still a single digit percentage of restaurants that exist in America. So how do you make this technology available for the masses? How do the other 90% of restaurant owners and operators get access to the same sandbox, the same synthetic data that the large chains are going to be or probably already are using? So how do we increase that adoption and make it more accessible?
Yeah, it's the age-old question, right? It's the age-old question. And what happened? What happened when we think about when we look back 15 years or so, and let's say we had a digital restaurant podcast. I don't think they existed 15 years ago, but if we did 15 years ago, and you and I were talking about how do the big guys today do labor scheduling, right? We would have been saying, I'm still doing this piece of paper, and I'm figuring out that Bob needs to be here and Rishi needs to be there. Well, now, of course, there's a SaaS solution for every restaurant out there that actually is at a minimal fee to allow labor schedules to be accommodated. You've got Seajoy over at GM Pilot creating his great thing around using artificial intelligence to help restaurant brands of all sizes take advantage of it. So when I think of that, it tells me that there should be hope for the little guy out there. But actually, in many ways, it's probably too early for many of them to get into that space right now because the big brands still are playing with it. And in a way, you want companies like mine at Invisible to work with the big brands to figure that stuff out, to be able to make it work into a meaningful model. And then ultimately what happens is it trickles down and helps the rest of the industry afterwards. But who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we will start to see synthetic data be utilized for some of the smaller brands. And maybe that's one of the differentiators that helps them grow. And let's finish up this week. I think many of us were probably impacted, whether we knew it or not, by an outage at something called Cloudflare. So, what is Cloudflare? Why are we so dependent on it? And what does it mean for restaurants?
Yeah, I'm not going to pretend to be smart enough to understand how the architecture of the entire internet, but Cloudflare, as I understand, is one of the largest DNS service providers and content partners for a lot of businesses and a lot of websites out there. And their job is to make the internet run better, faster, and more reliably. So ironic and painful whenever they go down. This was the largest Cloudflare outage since 2019. Important to know that there's Cloudflare outages time to time. I mean, they're a humongous tech stack and a very large company, and these things just they're natural, they're going to happen. In this case, it seems like they had some automated bots running that were just basically messing up. And there's probably a little more to be disclosed on this. This is still very new, so there's not a ton of information released by the company yet, but it certainly doesn't seem to be, at least at this stage, a cyber attack or anything like that. It's just a failure within the systems that were rolled out. So it could have been a software update or anything else. But Cloudflare powers a ton of sites: X, ChatGPT, Spotify. So a lot of massive sites, and amongst that, there's ton of course, relevant restaurant sites and brand sites and government sites and all sorts of things that rely on Cloudflare. It's not an easily replaceable part of the internet. They do something that's super unique, but where I tended to focus on this was it's always a good reminder to me that we need to have redundancies for the technology that we rely on. There's a tremendous amount of technology that we see on a large scale like Cloudflare, which powers the entire world, to even individual restaurants who now work with 20, 25, 30 different tech partners to power a variety of solutions both in and outside of their restaurant. And one thing I always think about is, do your restaurant employees know how to react if something goes down, if a POS system goes down, if the phone lines go down? Are there SOPs in place? Is there a crisis plan? Even to date, I've never run a restaurant operation that doesn't have a ticketing system. Pen and paper never go down. So if there's an opportunity to take a look and reflect on this within your own operation, it's to make sure that the more reliant we become on technology, the more important it is that we have backup plans for when that technology fails us.
Yeah, well said. It's quite scary actually when we think about how much our entire operating model is actually on the infrastructure, the pillars of some very few amounts of organizations. And I always remember when I was 16, 17, running a bunch of registers in a hardware store and the systems went down and we would bring out the old credit card machine, right? When you'd
Yeah,
have to
yeah.
like
Knuckle
carbon copy.
buster.
Yeah, and then I'd have to get on the phone call for some people to actually
Yeah,
verify whether it was like, oh my goodness, and you could see
that's
the
right.
customers getting mad. But at least that was in place, right? So this isn't a new challenge, but it does remind us that We've got to not just train our new team members, our new managers and our restaurants to accommodate and believe that this new technology can help them, but we've also got to remind them about plan B. So
That's right.
all right. Well, look, before we finish up, I would love to give you some time to talk a little bit about this wonderful business that you've been building in Franklin Junction. And in many ways, Rishi, you're like one of the last guys standing, right? There were a lot of names, probably names that got more attention, probably more names that got referenced more on this show. But Franklin Junction is still here, still doing some great things. Tell us about it. Why has it been successful? And where are you taking the company in the years ahead?
Well, thanks, Carl, for the opportunity to talk about Franklin Junction. We just passed our fifth birthday, actually, so we've been around for a while now. We set out to solve the problem of underutilized kitchen capacity, and we didn't really have a specific restaurant in mind. We weren't thinking QSR, full service, mom and pop, or chain. We knew as lifelong operators, builders, operators, developers of restaurants is that we've continued to overbuild restaurants, and we really didn't have a good answer for what do you do if you don't have enough demand. And that's where Franklin Junction was born out of, is that we were looking for a way to generate more revenue with this existing infrastructure that existed for restaurants. And the solution was that restaurants can become fulfillment centers for other brands who are looking to grow in their market. And so what that means is we'll take a restaurant that wants to grow in a new market, create a very scaled down express version of their menu, put it on a third party marketplace or other digital sales channel, but then the order is fulfilled by a local restaurant who has the kitchen capacity and the staff to produce that food. So it's a win-win for both partners, capital free expansion for both partners. And it's something that's been super sticky. I mean, we have a low single digit churn, and usually when we churn out a customer, it's because they've completely gone out of business. It's not because the virtual restaurant solution isn't working. So it's great to see that even 5 years later, we've been able to keep a lot of restaurants, help a lot of restaurants keep their lights on, keep a lot of people employed, and this continues to be a lasting solution. And our long view on the industry is that just like you have other categories of restaurants, QSR, fast casual, full service, fine dining, you're going to have host kitchens as a category of restaurants. These are going to be restaurants who have a primary focus in the dining room and a multi-brand focus digitally and out of their kitchen. And that's how they're going to optimize profitability and change their unit economics permanently for the better. And so we're super excited about that. We've sustained because we're super capital efficient. We have a team that's super agile, and we have a team of lifelong operators who at a base level on their at their to the core of their DNA understand the pains of running a restaurant and what it takes to make a profit there. And from there, it's really easy to build a solution because of their understanding and their affection for the problem.
Amazing. Well, congratulations on your success with that. If folks want to reach out and find out more, see if it's relevant for their restaurant, how do they get in touch?
They can follow us on LinkedIn. They can reach out to us directly at info@franklinjunction.com. And they're certainly welcome to email, call, text me anytime I can help them.
Great. And of course, if they want me to send a referral through, then I get a free burger or something. Isn't that what we agreed? Something like that? I'm
That's
pretty
right.
sure. Yeah. Well, Rishi, thanks as always for joining. Always appreciate your insights on this space. If you have any views or questions or comments about what we've covered today, have you been affected by the Cloudflare outage? What are you going to do about it in the future? And what about synthetic data? Is synthetic data part of your future and your marketing decisions? Lots that we covered this week. Love to hear your views. And if you haven't yet subscribed, as always, please do. But until next time, happy Thanksgiving and thanks for watching. The Digital Restaurant Podcast is available for you to follow and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. Watch us, rate us, and subscribe to The Digital Restaurant on YouTube, and follow along on all our social media digital restaurant channels. Thanks for listening.